Hi, this is Paul. This video dropped a couple of days ago of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and Douglas Murray. And this, again, I thought was really an outstanding conversation. Now, Jordan sort of starts it imagining what they're going to talk about, and they don't talk about that. Why I was so interested in this video is because in my European tour, in the letters and emails I receive, in the comments section in the Discord, many times I bump into people who, for one reason or another, want to find their way back to a fully embodied religious faith, one that believes in a personal God, one that believes in a God who hears and answers prayer, one that believes in a God that can be connected with through religious services, through church, through community, all of the things that religion did before, as John Vervaeke noted, people were sort of cut off from that deeply meaningful way of connecting with the ultimate, with what is most ultimately meaningful, and traditionally what gave people the ability to bear the incredible suffering that human life can give. And this conversation goes there and goes there very quickly. Now, Jordan sort of begins it with saying why he thinks they're there, and he doesn't stay there.
Hello, everyone watching and listening. I'm very excited today to bring to you two of my favorite people, I would say, Douglas Murray and Jonathan Pageau. I wanted to bring the three of us together to talk about the underlying metaphysical and theological substrate, if any, that constitutes the precondition for classic conservatism, small L liberalism, and maybe Enlightenment rationality, as well as, let's say, classic Western religious belief, which is sort of obviously linked to that.
And that last thing, where it's kind of put together as kind of thrown out, is really where the conversation's going to lie.
That underlying metaphysic, or maybe the substrate for it. I got interested in talking to Douglas about this because we've been talking over a couple of years, and he's become more convinced, I suppose, or at least curious about the relationship between pure rationality and an ethic that might be associated with pure Enlightenment rationality, and the relationship between that and an underlying substrate of fiction or narrative or perhaps religious belief. And I couldn't think of anybody better to talk about that with than Jonathan Pageau. I've been speaking with Jonathan many times, particularly with John Vervaeke, or at least occasionally with John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist who's also interested in the same things. And so
this conversation is very much going to be on target with the kind of conversations that we're having in this little corner of the internet.
I thought we'd have a chance today to delve deeply into the bottom of things on the political and conceptual and philosophical front. And so I'll start with a brief bio, both of Mr. Murray and Mr. Pageau.
I don't know if we need that, so I'm going to zip through it.
And then, as I know, I want to follow up polluting and passion in the 36. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be able to introduce the both of you. And Douglas, maybe I'll get you to open. I remembered, and I was struck by the comments that you made, I believe, when you were talking to Dave Rubin, about the transformation of your thoughts in relationship to religious conceptualization, and your insistence or your realization or your speculation that something like a fictional metaphysic or is a necessary precondition for the stabilization of more rational worldviews, including conservative, liberal, and perhaps scientific.
It's, as he stated it there, I mean, later in the conversation, Pageau's going to say, yeah, fictional is really sort of not the right word, but Jordan almost lays out sort of a presuppositionalist stance that you don't actually build from the imagined material ground up through all of these sort of first principle deductive arguments to get to the world. Presuppositionalists for a very long time have basically been saying you have to start with certain assumptions, and without those assumptions, you basically have nowhere to begin.
And so hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth. I hope I derived the right gist and conclusion from your comments. And so I'd be happy to hear what you have to say about all that.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you both, and particularly to meet Jonathan for the first time. I don't know if there's been a shift in the last few years in my thinking, but certainly in the last 15 years or so, there's no doubt about that. I was brought up a Christian, and indeed in adulthood was a believing Christian into my late 20s. As is, I think...
Now, that little tidbit is not a small thing. In my experience, people who were raised Christians have, even from a fairly early age, even until 11 or 12, have an easier time sort of going back into faith than, let's say, those who were raised completely apart from it.
Sometimes quite common. I fell into atheism, I became a non-believer in my, I suppose, late 20s. And there were lots of reasons for that we could get into. But I was very much a sort of part of that, a minor part of that new atheism movement in the 2000s. And I suppose I had a period in which I thought that was enough.
Now that phrase, that was enough, is a fun place to pause, because you'd have to ask, enough for what? And I think right there, you have a sense of where people are at. Enough for, well, to go to work every day. Enough to have a reason to go to work every day. Enough to bear, few people make the... stated as well as Jordan in terms of the unbearable burden of suffering that, even very comfortable, affluent Western people face, which would seem very strange to many people who live in the rest of the world, that probably derive a significant baseline of meaning from the kinds of survival suffering that human beings have faced throughout their lives, but that sort of rationality would be enough, and the enough means both for an individual, but I think also for a society, that the society could derive a communal ethic together, agreement about the good. Now, again, as I've said in many previous videos, so much of this ethic of the West is simply its inheritance from Christianity, and while it continues to want to dismiss and push away Christianity as not only an irrational mythology, but an immoral legacy, the concern by people like Douglas Murray and Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson has been that dismissal, that rejection will probably cut off the civilization at its roots, leaving it to thrash about wildly and do all sorts of things that 50 years ago would be thought unimaginable.
And through the years that followed that, I suppose I had some of the zeal of the convert, as it were, that can happen with atheists as much as it can happen with the religious. With the zeal of the convert, once that sort of fell away a bit, I was left with the same questions that I was before, with perhaps a less dogmatic tone. And I suppose one of the things that was on my mind increasingly in the 2010s was that question of what's often been, many people are credited with the thought, but the German jurist Bochenförde, Ernst Wolfgang Bochenförde, is usually regarded as having done it most epigrammatically, which is to pose the question, can a society continue to survive in its form if it has cut itself off from the things that gave it birth?
I think Douglas Murray is probably one of the best people at articulating this anxiety. And when he says cut it off from its form, even people in our context who want to decry common elements of our culture, capitalism, let's say, the affluence, people who want to decry that, I generally don't find them terribly serious. One of the things that I look around at is I compare people today who are making radical sounds to people that I remember making radical sounds in the 70s. And in the 70s, it seemed people had much more of an appetite to actually try to live simply. You know, even my own parents, when they really embraced the ministry to the inner city, to urban Peterson, they very much embraced an incarnational mode. And today, I simply find a lot of people mouthing all kinds of idealistic slogans. They might be against capitalism, but they sure are for getting rich. They might be against capitalism, but they sure do want their pleasures. They might be all about, saving the planet because of climate change, but they're going to get on an airplane with everybody else. And so what I tend to see today is an awful lot of posturing. And when I listen to Douglas Murray here, I really hear someone who is honestly wrestling with this. And he, like many, and I think often when I listen to Tom Holland, very much in a similar place, right on the edge. Peterson too, but I don't know. Peterson's always different in these conversations. The edge doesn't seem quite as clear with Peterson as it does with Murray and Holland, even though I suspect Murray and Holland are attending church more often than Jordan. And so my interest in all of this tends to be much more pastoral. Murray's about to make a point here that is really critical, that when I listen to, let's say, someone like Doug Wilson, who is a very interesting guy, I wouldn't be surprised to see Doug Wilson sort of have a Doug Reacts video to this video. But sort of where Doug Wilson and I part company is I think Doug just says, well, you have to believe. And I don't know, maybe I have to challenge Doug Wilson's Calvinism on this, because I don't think belief is simply volitional like that. Now, we can be invited to believe, but I don't think people can just sort of make themselves believe. I think it's part of our makeup that we find ourselves believing, sort of like we find ourselves in all kinds of states of repulsion and attraction. And that doesn't mean that these states can't be adjusted over time, usually more with training rather than trying. But this, I think, is really where I come into this, and I listen and say, I think as a church, we should welcome these people. We should sit down with them. We should encourage them, because I actually think that if, in fact, they want to pursue full-fledged believing, that this is a matter of community and practice over time, and that the feelings will follow.
In other words, if you like Western societies, if you like societies like Britain, America, and elsewhere, there are several directions you can go in. One is to pretend that these societies owe nothing to Christianity, or the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is something that is attempted as a claim by some people. I think it's obviously risible. Once you accept that the Christian tradition at least gave a very significant amount, at least was an incredibly important strand of our societies, and that what we treasure and cherish in our societies today, we would not treasure or cherish if we didn't have that inheritance. Once you accept that, then there's this question of...
Now, this is partly to the point that almost everyone, even self-consciously atheist people themselves, this is Tom Holland's huge point, are deeply Christian. And their formation is so thoroughly Christian. and their context is so thoroughly impacted by the ethic of Jesus Christ and the evolving ethic of the church through the West that they simply can't escape it. Now, if they want to sort of put Jesus on a shelf next to other religious figures, if they want to despise their Christian heritage because of the sins of the church and the sins of Christian nations, they can do all this, but they do this at their peril because what they have simply assumed. I've got a great clip from Tom Holland who makes this point.
We'll start with Gavin at the front here. Questions, not statements. We haven't got much time. Thank you.
I want to throw back to Tom a question he once asked me, but I'd like him to answer it. Tom, once we had a small discussion, and you said the very distinctive thing about the church was that, as you quite just said, it really does believe in good and evil. It's nothing if it doesn't have a metaphysical vision. Most of the people here, I think, would sign up to that metaphysics. One difficulty we have is persuading a highly secularized society that our metaphysical vision isn't something at the level of Victorian fairy tales. As someone who straddles both worlds, do you have any advice for us in the way in which we can reacquaint our society with the seriousness of what is almost a dualistic metaphysical narrative in order to catch their imagination sufficiently for us to be able to tell the Christian story with effect?
Well, I think the key is for people in the West to be culturally humble and to recognise that their values are not universal, as I said. So another one would obviously be human rights. Because the West has been so hegemonic for so long, it's been in a position to assume that its concept of human rights is somehow universal. They don't need to think about it. Of course human rights exist. But what the rise of China and of other civilizational powers is doing is to remind us that the concept of human rights is one that has emerged in a very specific cultural matrix, which is a Christian one. And that therefore, if you want to believe in human rights, you have to believe. It takes a leap of faith to believe that there are things called human rights, just as much as it takes a leap of faith to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ raised from the dead.
Now, what's interesting there is that people find themselves, by virtue of their formation, by virtue of the status games around us, by virtue of trying to be a good person, people find themselves innocently, naively, and when I say naively, I don't mean that in the pejorative sense, innocently, naively, completely with a sense of self-evidence that human rights is real. Many who are brought up in the church can feel a similar way. Now, this really gets deep and complicated, but can feel a similar way about the resurrection of Jesus. Now, how deep does it go? How much, you would really know that to the degree that a person begins to no longer fear death. But Tom's point here is clear, that the kinds of belief that our society as a community that forms people, have built into people widespread, whether or not they believe in God, whether or not they identify as Christians, is belief that human rights are somehow a real thing and are not self-evident.
They're both beliefs. And the fact that most people in the West sign up to the fact that human rights exist and that they're important and that they should determine, say, national policy, public policy.
So there's a belief that, people say, we don't want our Christian beliefs impacting public policy. Well, but you have no problem with your human rights beliefs impacting public policy. In fact, you insist on it.
It's as rooted in theology and myth and metaphysics as all the teachings of Christianity. And I think that once people are reminded of that, I think it becomes impossible not to feel a kind of greater sense of where, what Christianity is about. Because, if you believe,
And I think that point that Tom makes just simply isn't true. because it's sort of a rationalist who says, well, here's the one belief and here's the other belief. Can't you see that they're both the same? And the vast majority of people will say, no, I can't. I can't. Because one is simply true and the other is this superstition. That's what they will say, because people are not really all that rational when it comes to these things.
If you believe in human rights, why not believe that Jesus rose from the dead? You might as well hang for a sheep as a lamb. I think that it reminding people that the core beliefs that are fundamental to how people morally define themselves is rooted in faith reopens the possibility for secularists to recognize that they have not kind of emancipated themselves from the need for faith.
I don't know that it necessarily reopens. I think we can see how it might, but does it actually? Because I think, again, people are formed in much more basic ways, and that then gets into the mythology, the ritual, the community, all of those ways that people are actually formed in terms of their beliefs. Beliefs are the product of a whole variety of things in a human being's life.
They continue to illustrate it. And I think that kind of contemplating that then reopens the possibility to think, well, where might this practice of believing in fantastical things lead? But I think one of the things that the churches need to do is to kind of absolutely embrace this, rather than being slightly embarrassed about it and only talking about the kind of things that you'd hear on a Liberal Democrat Party political broadcast, which is a kind of, thought for the day thing. I mean, I think that thought for the day and, the kind of religious studies GCSE where you compare what Buddhists and Muslims think about smoking, that kind of stuff, I think it's absolutely destructive because it just kind of makes everything a mush. I think that the churches have to lay claim to everything that is kind of that is weirdest, most countercultural, most peculiar. Don't kind of duck all the stuff about angels and things. I mean, major on that, because...
Oops. Now, Holland will make that thought for the day point in the conversation that I had with him in London as well. And you can basically hear Tom Holland making this point again and again and again in the talks that he's given, usually with Christians. He had an interesting conversation with John Anderson. Again, one of the conversations that is sort of in my list that I really want to get to if really interesting conversations like this one don't keep coming out. But I certainly don't want to stop the flow. But Holland's point that, well, if you keep looking at the strange, and this I think in some ways is borne out by the success of Pentecostal churches in the West, in the rest of the world. It's sort of the anti-moderns, like the Pentecostals, that for some people have done particularly well. Now, not for all. And I think despite where, let's say, Tom and Douglas Murray are at, I don't know that Pentecostalism really grabs them. And so then you sort of have the two modes. One would be sort of the Pentecostalism, anti-modern, we don't care what modernity says. Jesus is big and bold and will answer my prayers and will heal my son, and we're going to go after this, no holds barred, versus we're going to bring you in with our cathedrals and our arts and our very polished liturgy and amazing use of language, and we are going to woo you and embed around you in a way that, to some degree, even Disney can't match.
Is that society you have able to sustain itself? Are the things you love able to sustain themselves and be replenished without reference to the thing that gave them birth? Put it another way, let's say we're sitting on a branch Does the branch remain up if the roots of the tree are not nurtured?
And this anxiety, I think, in some ways is based on an implicit acknowledgement of the fact that our beliefs are products of a far bigger, richer life. They're not simply products of our will. They're not simply generally products. Now, I've seen people converted with a sermon, but I would have to argue that there's a whole lot of other things that goes into that. And in fact, the combinatorial explosiveness behind any one individual's journey to faith is too much for any of us to reckon. And I think the best Christian language for this is, in many ways, sort of my Calvinist position, that it is the Holy Spirit that turns the light on. Well, the Holy Spirit is, of course, God number one and God number two.
That putting it that way, of course, makes the answer rather obvious, which is, well, obviously not. I mean, if you use the branch of the tree analogy, obviously that doesn't work. That's like sawing off the branch you're sitting on. But then that poses a further question, and I addressed this a bit in the book you referred to there, Jordan, The Strange Death of Europe. There are a number of chapters I use in that book, which is about movement of peoples in the 21st century, the ease of movement, migration, and many other difficult questions. But the part of the book which, at least I think is most significant, if I say so myself, is the portion on what I describe as a state of Western man's belief in the 21st century. That history has happened, discoveries have happened, biblical criticism has happened, Darwin has happened, science has happened, discoveries have happened, the way in which we used to explain things we didn't know by putting God in there has increasingly been narrowed, so that increasingly we know through science and discoveries how.
And just want to mention, this is quite a bit earlier in my video, probably more than a year. The God of the Gaps always sort of imagines, if you think about, let's say, a jigsaw puzzle on a table, that God is the missing pieces of the puzzle, that you have no jigsaw piece there to complete the picture. And I would argue that, in many ways, the God of Christianity is the table beneath the puzzle. And you see pieces, of course, coming that are, you see the table through the missing pieces, but the imagination that God continues to shrink because the table continues, because the puzzle pieces continue to grow. I would argue, in fact, if you listen to a Neil deGrasse Tyson video, the truth is that the more we discover, the more we learn we don't know. So in fact, instead of having the imagination that we are slowly putting the pieces of the puzzle together and covering the table, the truth is that the more pieces of the puzzle we lay on the table, the larger the table grows.
How certain things in our universe happen, how certain things in our bodies happen, and the role of God diminished and diminished. But that, as I explained it in Strange Death of Europe, that we are in this, and I myself am in this uncomfortable position, because, of course, if you believe that what you, and recognize that what you love and want to sustain is a very significant part from this particular route, what do you do? Various theologians, albeit perhaps heretical theologians, like Don Cupid and Richard Holloway, have also asked this question. But it's a difficult and, I admit, frustrating position to be in, the one that I hold, because in part, and I think, Jordan, you yourself have experienced this, in part it's frustrating because Christians say, well, therefore, why don't you just believe? And that's not as straightforward as those Christians seem to think.
And I think Douglas Murray is dead on right there. And I think this is where Christians really have to listen to Douglas Murray. And Christians have to, this is why, of course, I have been instrumental in founding estuary groups, because in my opinion, an estuary group is a place where you can have a conversation like this and people can explore ideas, and Christians jump in and are worried, well, what if they have an argument that I can't contend with? Well, are you going to somehow deal with that danger by not being present in a room when people raise these arguments? Why are you so timid? I think it's a matter of faith that one says, I am going to go into these conversations and in these relationships. And I think, Peterson often makes the point that in the Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha does not win the argument. But in many ways, Alyosha wins the book because, as I said, you don't believe because of arguments. Arguments can be helpful. Arguments can arise. But you believe because of a life, and a life is combinatorially explosively far larger than an argument. And the greatest evangelistic power that Christians have in many ways is the long, slow, cruciform life of discipleship. That kind of life, especially in a context where we are privileged to live, where that sort of self-denial is seen as the highest moral good. If Christians live that way, then suddenly people will say, I might have doubts about the propositional elements of the story, but those are the people I want to live with. And if they are going to go into a special room and celebrate and mourn and feast and commune, I want to be with them. Whether or not I believe everything they believe, whether or not I can trust everything that they trust, but those are the people I want to journey with. Those are the people I want to be my friends. If the church can do that, then some of these issues about, well, can we find the arguments that finally overcome Darwin and Marx and Freud and all of the anxiety about the subtraction story that Douglas Murray just told? Charles Taylor calls it a subtraction story. Then they will say, well, even despite all of that, I want to be with these people. And I think for the Christian church and its influence in society, that is the best strategy moving forward.
They seem to think, well, we've got you in a corner by you recognizing what you owe to the religion. So therefore, make the final leap.
And it's interesting because Douglas Murray's point here is almost similar to Tom Holland's admonition to Gavin. How Gavin was on Unbelievable just recently, and so Gavin's story has been around now. Gavin is another interesting guy, but Douglas is, I think, speaking honestly and truly, and again, I think Christians have to listen to him, and Christians have to say to someone like Douglas, hey, I get you. I understand where you're at. You are welcome in my spaces. You are welcome in my home. You are welcome in my church. Hang with us. And whether or not you believe, you can be with us. And let's travel this road together.
Big government can...
What? I'm not going to... Hang on, let's get through this.
continue
the question here, and you tell me what you think about this, and then maybe Jonathan can chime in.
And I don't know if this was, obviously there was a cut there, but I don't know if nobody quite knew what to say to Doug there, but that was one of the most powerful parts of the whole video, what Doug did just right there.
And so, you know, the battle between the atheist, rationalist, materialists, let's say, and the religious types, if it's played out on the battleground set by the atheist materialists, is a battle between the claims that the scientific mode of explanation and the religious mode of explanation are alike in kind, but different in conclusion. And so that
I think that point that Jordan is making there is a terrific point.
You have a description of the world where God's a causal agent, and you have a description of the world where natural processes are causal agents, and the scientists tend to win that battle. But then...
And I think, going back in my channel, my conversations with Brett Sockold, you can hear Bishop Barron talk about this in various debates. The Roman Catholics have had, they talk about primary and secondary causes. Let's say, let's say someone is robbing a bank with a computer. On one hand, the use of the internet, the use of the programming, the use of the computer, the use of the electricity, the use of all of this isn't necessarily what's going to send the person to jail. But the agency of the electronic bank robber is built upon other levels of agency. And so what Peterson says, I think the point he makes right here is the point they often make, that often when I listen to these atheist-theist debates, God for the atheist is a super thing in the sky. And as I've said many times, I think they come by that idea naturally listening to how Christians talk about God. But again, as has been true with many atheist-Christian debates over a long period of time, with usually Christians who have a little bit more preparation in theology, that God is not like kind in terms of this sort of causes. But this gets into my God number one, God number two conversation.
And I think, well, there's a problem with that, because it isn't obvious to me at all that the way that God is conceptualized in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and maybe more universally, is as an analog of a material cause. If I look through the biblical canon and the way that God is characterized as a character, let's say, in some sense as a fictional character, and I'll return to...
And I've made a similar point to, can you find Tolkien in Middle-earth?
To that idea. His essence is something more like role model and spirit to emulate. It's something like a mode of being. It's an enacted mode of being in the world, rather than a pure causal agent. And the problem with the scientific endeavor is that, as Hume so famously pointed out, there's a huge gap between is and ought. And what I see offered on the religious front is an answer to the question of ought. And then I'll add one more thing to that. So this is how you ought to behave. But not only to behave, but how you ought to perceive, how you ought to make a hierarchy of your attentional resources so that you're looking at the right thing and acting in the right way toward the proper goals all the time. How do you orient yourself to do that? And so that, and I don't think that first of all, the atheist types can't respond to that, because there's no way that they can produce an ethic on the fly in some sense, and that was Hume's objection. And it also, thinking about the problem this way, see, it also opens the door to a deeper understanding of the role that fiction and mythology play, because you can think of fiction, including mythology, as a form of abstraction.
Part of the difficulty of what Jordan's doing here is just thrown way too many ideas all at once on top of the argument, and it's going to be now whatever idea anybody is sort of fixed on in terms of what they've listened to them, that tends to be, well, where they'll go after, and that's not, it doesn't necessarily help the conversation progress in an orderly way.
That characterizes patterns of behavior and action, rather than a form of abstraction that describes the world the way science does. And that way fiction becomes a different kind of truth, which is a pragmatic truth rather than a descriptive or propositional truth, and it's oriented towards ethics and the direction of attention.
Now, his point about fiction, I think, is a good one, One of the things that someone pointed out to me recently was at the beginning of the 20th century, well, actually it was from my Marsden books about the history of the university. At the beginning of the 20th century, theology in most of the major universities in the United States, and I assume in many places in the West, theology was sort of the queen of the sciences. I was struck when I was reading biographies of C.S. Lewis that when he, after the First World War, started to pursue his life as an academic, English departments in the early part of the 20th century were brand new. English was a brand new discipline. And I thought, the English language has been around a long time. Why would that be? Well, in many ways, the humanities were increasingly replacing theology. And that goes to Jordan's point here. So instead of reading the Bible as sort of a guide for one's moral life, reading the Bible as something that we can feed off of to nourish someone's moral imagination, literature, English literature, became that for the civilization. And to go all the way back to the point that Peterson makes about Dostoevsky often, that, yeah, you're using a truth in literature to sort of allow the to nourish someone's moral imagination. Now, what's really interesting about this is that, as they're going to say, biblical literature tends to make claims about history in a way that most fiction does not. What I think is interesting is the way in which stories themselves shape us morally, whether they are purported to be based on a true story or something of that nature. And I think this is a clue, this is a tell in terms of this moral formation that is underneath the sort of overt propositional beliefs that someone like Douglas Murray and Tom Holland are struggling with. In other words, part of what we're seeing is obviously since the advent of the printing press, but now especially in the 20th century with printing getting absolutely, after the Industrial Revolution, printing getting incredibly inexpensive. And now the proliferation of storytelling in Netflix and TV streaming, in YouTube, this vast proliferation, that now suddenly this foundation for our moral universe is getting more and more bloated. Is that the right word? Because in many ways, again, as Tom Holland said, but in many ways, the Christian Bible is sort of the rootstock out of which some of the best storytelling unfolds. I think it's partly because the famous saying that our imagination is so that our imagined selves die in the place of our physical selves. I think what, in a sense, we do with literature is we sort of dream and we just compile imaginary and fictional stories to influence our imaginations as to how then we should live. And those stories can, like our dreams, be fantastical. They can be full of elves or spaceships or countries far away, or people that we've never met, or people that are just imagined, or even cartoon characters. But I do wonder if all of this story is just part of the deep formation that then becomes the sort of presuppositional believe or don't believe as we sort of go into life.
And so I'm increasingly thinking about the heavenly hierarchy as a internal, in some sense, psychological structure through which we see the world. And I'll add one more thing to that and turn it over to Jonathan. The other thing that strikes me as psychologically unassailable is the fact that you need a uniting principle to orient your perceptions and actions toward for two reasons, two fundamental reasons, three fundamental reasons. One is, if you're aiming towards something valuable, that gives you positive emotion and hope. And so all the motivation that goes along with that fills you with enthusiasm. Second, if you don't have a uniting ethic that governs your own perceptions and actions, then you're confused and in disarray. And the cost of that is anxiety and hopelessness and pain and frustration and disappointment and grief, all of the negative emotions. And then third, if you don't have a uniting ethic, and so that has to be united under something like a monotheistic superordinate entity, if you don't have that, then you have social disarray, because there's nothing that unites people in their common ethical pursuit, and that's their behavior and their perceptions. And so,
and I think what Peterson said right there answers the point that Murray's made in his sort of opening remarks about, he sort of grabbed onto New Atheism as a religious zealous would, and thought that it would be enough. And I think the point that Peterson just made there was that it was tried and wanting. Now, I am reading a book for a friend that someone is working on, and I'm really excited about this book. And if he listens to this video, he'll know I'm talking about his book. I'm not going to say his name. I'm not going to say too much about the book, but I'm reading a book for a friend who walks through a lot of this history of New Atheism in the early chapters, and what happened to New Atheism, as James Lindsay in my conversation with him a number of years ago now pointed out, was the fracture of New Atheism into, let's say, old New Atheism and then Atheism plus. That instinctively, intuitively, elements of the New Atheist community imagine that just rejecting the super thing in the sky was insufficient. It was insufficient navigation for putting a world together. But these groups have never been able to even compete, let's say, when it comes to the sorts of fully embodied, ritualized, disciplined, communal structures and communities that churches and even religions that have, in my opinion, really weak backstories, and really and mythologies that are basically developed by hucksters and con artists, and these are people in the 19th and 20th century for whom we have a tremendous amount of information on. Even those religions, in some ways, far outcompete New Atheism or even Atheism plus. And when you hear that, you have to stop and ask yourself about what human beings are and what we need. And so what we tend to see then right now with this mass proliferation of stories that have sort of replaced, let's say, fairy tales, the biblical corpus, traditional storytelling, you might see, let's say, among Star Wars, a little bit of, Comic-Con, let's say, is about as religious as a lot of these people are going to get. But I think Peterson's point here is key, that you can't really get anywhere by building on anything with this.
I'll let Jonathan comment on that a bit.
No, I think what you're saying is right on track.
Jonathan's got a lot to comment on now.
That is, one of the problems that happened in the story of Christianity is something like the Enlightenment and modernism, which is that as the world was moving towards this notion of mechanical causation and the interest in mechanical causation, came to be a misunderstanding of the way that traditional Christians believe the world actually existed. And so there's a difference between the material causes and something like the vertical cause of something. And the vertical cause of something.
Okay, now Jonathan's about to go into this, and it's a really good point. But one of the things I want to bring in at some point is, now I'm doing this at home. I don't have my whole setup, so I can't just pull things quite as easily into this. Is C.S. Lewis's Oxford English Dictionary, English literature in the 16th century. I want to get into this book at some point, in terms of sort of some of the deep things that changed in the world.
As the world was moving towards this notion of mechanical causation and the interest in mechanical causation, there came to be a misunderstanding of the way that traditional Christians believe the world actually existed. And so there's a difference between the material causes and something like the vertical cause of something. And the vertical cause of something is exactly this hierarchy that Jordan is talking about.
And I think when Jonathan says the vertical cause, I think many people are going to wonder, what on earth does he mean by that? Jonathan's talking about different aspects of causation. And so let's go back to the example of the person who's going to rob a bank with a computer. You could just see aspects of causation in many movies. Let's say, so you want to let's look at the end of one of the Matrix films where they have to get into this. They have to get into this deeply guarded place, and so they're going to cut the power. So one way to undercut causation is to deal with the various different levels of causation. Now, Jonathan, again, when the Thunder Bay videos are released, Jonathan has a very interesting way of looking at any agency relies upon reducing combinatory explosiveness into instantiations of things that we can perceive and act upon, and things that are acting upon us.
And I would push what Jordan is saying even further. That is, it does actually affect, to a certain extent, even the is, because we can't perceive an is without a hierarchy of attention and without a hierarchy of perception, because the world is indefinite in detail and in quantity. And so for even to be able to say this, to point to something, to say that, is already in this hierarchy of something we could call vertical causation.
And so I don't have my cell phone stand here, but I do have this little container for the headphones that I'm using here, because I don't have my usual setup in the office. This isness, when I say, well, this, and you might say, well, probably you're thinking, okay, well, that's the entire stand. Now, let's imagine, however, that if this weren't a kind of a cheap plastic container for headphones that you can buy on the internet, but this were, let's say, a jewelry box, and if I would point to that suddenly it might mean, let's say, a diamond ring for an engagement, or a massive stone that a group of people are wrangling over as the central plot figure for a heist movie. And you begin to see that Pageau's right, that this isness, and he's saying this comes from above. There's no thisness from below. Let's imagine that I'm holding this up to you, and you are someone from a part of the world that has never seen a zipper. And you might think that I have this round thing, but what's this dangly thing? You might think I'm talking about the zipper. Or maybe you're from a part of the world who doesn't have any elastic, and all of the rest of this is just nothing. You pay absolutely no attention to it, and the only thing you're paying attention to is the elastic. And Pageau's point is that there's a verticality that comes in that we don't see. We assume it, partly because it is not only constructed individually, it is constructed by the story within which we are embedded. For example, if in fact, again, this is a prop in a heist movie, the isness of this and everything that surrounds it, everything that's nested within, is a function of the heist movie. And if, let's say, you have a family that is unhappy because they're fighting over an inheritance, and there's a safety deposit box, and what I'm holding is an envelope that has the key to a safety deposit box. Nobody's paying attention to the envelope. Nobody's paying attention to the metal. What they're paying attention to is the story around which that object has meaning. And that's what Jordan Peterson means when he says we see objects, we don't see things.
So this glass has millions and millions of aspects to it, but we nonetheless are able to see it as one. And the fact that we see it as one is a total mystery to scientists. They don't know how to account for it. They use words like emergence, and you could just use the word magic and it would be the same. It's like this jump into unity. That is the type of causation that we talk about when we talk about religious causation.
Well, that unity that you discuss in relationship to the glass is a pragmatic unity, because
with a unity of good. It's
well,
unity
that's
of
also
purpose.
unity
It's
of
a
good.
unity
Well,
of-
then you think, well,
it's an ethical in a
Jonathan didn't get long for his speech.
general, very general sense. It's an ethical unity because
it is an
it's
ethical
towards a
unity.
good.
Well, I would say in a specific sense, because if you were a photorealist painter, you could spend a month painting all the reflections on that glass. It's a very complex thing to perceive, but you perceive it as a unity, and we know this neuropsychologically. We know this scientifically. You perceive it as a unity.
And by now, Douglas might be worried about the fact that his really wonderful opening speech is sort of like, what did Douglas talk about?
Because you can grip it, and because you can raise it to your lips, and because you can drink it, and because you need to drink water to survive, and you are willing to drink water to survive because you believe emotionally and motivationally and perhaps rationally that survival is a good, and that's dependent on your belief that human existence in some sense is a good, and that it's striving towards some sort of higher unified order. And you might think, well, you don't need all that to perceive the glass. And the answer is, yeah, as a matter of fact, you need all of that to perceive the glass. And if you lose some of that because of various forms of cortical damage, let's say, you enter into the realm of all sorts of bizarre blindnesses. And so that point you make about the is being dependent on the ought is also extremely interesting, because if the world is infinitely complex, which seems to be...
Now, the cortical blindnesses he talked about, if you go back to my previous videos, and I talked about the TED Talk that's on YouTube, where the woman who can't see the flames coming out of the picture of the house, but always selects the house she would like to live in, and the one without the flames. It's all these blind sight people. They can't register consciously some of what they're seeing, but obviously what's before their eyes is getting into them because they're having galvanic stimulus skin response or things of that nature.
Be the case, or close enough. The hierarchy of attention you bring to bear on it, and so your intent, determines in no small part the array of manifestations that infinity will produce in your field of apprehension. And that does determine to some degree at least what elements of the object you have access to, and then manipulate and then bring into being. I've been thinking about objects too as this, so they have this reality surrounded by a field of possibility, right? And so the object isn't just what it is, it's also a set of things that it could become.
Which, again, would be the envelope that has the safe deposit key amidst the family that is fighting about an inheritance.
Varying degrees of difficulty depending on your intent. So it's a combination of being and becoming.
Could become a weapon, but it couldn't become a car.
Right.
So it has an identity, but it's also surrounded by a field of possibilities. That's a good way to talk about it.
Right.
And this is where I wish someone else was in the room to say, let's pause here, because I know that Jordan and Jonathan are making a point that is sort of, what's interesting about these larger conversations is that these points sort of get made communally. This is a point that you'll find, the point that they're making right here is a point that you'll find made often at the Thunder Bay Conference. in a little sub-community here, certain points, certain realizations sort of come to the surface and are sort of talked about and reinforced. It's sort of like fads in churches, or fads in sermon series or something like that. But at some point, let's get back to Douglas Murray, who I think has laid out what for me is the real challenge. And again, if you go all the way back to Jordan's introductory speech here, well, this is going to be about conservatism. Well, we're not really talking about conservatism at all here.
Right.
I thought the point is that when we look at the way that the creation of the world is described in Genesis, it's related exactly to that. God creates something, sees it, and sees that it's good. And so there's this notion of apprehension of identities and realizing that those identities have to do with the fact that they're bound up in a value judgment, even though it's not necessarily moral. It's just a value judgment about how good something is. Because if I see a glass...
And this was, what Jonathan is talking about here was the topic of the speech he gave at Thunder Bay.
I am always asking, is it a good glass? Even if I don't do it consciously, necessarily. Because I know that it's there to grip and to drink from. And it's the same, even scientists are doing that because they have to focus their attention on something because they can't study everything at once. They have to decide, I'm going to study this, and I'm going to decide the reason why I study that, and therefore I'm going to be able to identify the facts that fit with my theory and prove my theory. So even the scientist is moving in this type of perception of the world, even sometimes without realizing it.
I'd like to make a comment on the scientific.
And I'd like to sort of nuance what Jonathan just said there, is that the dynamic that Jonathan is pointing out is beneath the conscious level of the scientist. What does the scientist decide is relevant? This is where it connects up with Vervaekean relevance realization. What does the scientist decide is relevant to study for some imagined good that is meaningful that the scientist wishes to pursue? The scientist could say, well, I want to really go into depth on this headphone case. And someone might say, okay, well, I suppose that would be a valid scientific thing, but there are going to be hungry people coming up because of such and such a thing coming into the world, and this is what you're going to spend your time on? What about infectious disease? What Pageau is noting is that there's already an imagined communally sourced, value-laden world of the good that the scientist is embedded in, which means that the scientist isn't just some monarchical vision up from first principles product of some rational, because that good you're not going to come at from nowhere.
Scientific front too, and I really started to think about this after talking to Dr. Dawkins, and I suppose to some degree to Sam Harris too on the atheist front. And so I know that as the death of God in the Nietzschean terms has progressed, we've lost faith in an increasing range of underlying realities. And the first might be the deistic reality. But then what we've seen happening under the onslaught of postmodernist thought is that we're starting to lose faith in the idea of fact itself. And then I was thinking, well, what's the precondition for being a scientist? And I thought, well, in some sense, there's deistic preconditions, because one of the things that characterizes scientists, and this includes people like Dawkins, who's a real scientist, is that the scientist presumes axiomatically that there's a transcendent realm outside the domain of epistemological theory. So if you have a scientific theory and you're a real scientist, you know that your theory, which is really what you see when you look at the world, you know that your theory is insufficient in comparison to the reality that transcends it. And so then as a scientist, what you try to do is you try to pit your theory up against the transcendent reality so that it fails, so that you find something about what you don't understand that is able to make itself manifest. Then you adjust the theory to get a better grip on the world, and you assume while you're doing that there's an underlying logic to the transcendent object, and that analysis of that underlying object is both corrective and redemptive. And as far as I can tell, those are all essentially axiomatic religious claims, and that and that they're preconditions for any true empirical science. And then, so what that implies.
And I think that's a powerful point that Jordan just makes there. It itself would be a really wonderful topic for its own treatment, that there are, again, this is sort of a presuppositionalism, that scientists presuppose an order out there in the world, and that this order is intelligible, and that they can engage with it. Now, many have argued that this is the reason why science arises out of Christendom, because Christendom had the kind of God who was so ordered, so that when, for example, Newton was studying what would become known as Newtonian mechanics, that this was in some ways a theology, because he was pursuing knowledge of God number one, that God number one was so faithful, and so the God who is an arena is so faithful and so reliable that it doesn't matter how many times I drop this little Now that then, of course, will translate into deism, as Peterson just said. So again, this point that Peterson makes right there is an enormously powerful point. The point that Pageau makes is enormously powerful. Kind of the challenge we're having is that Douglas Murray sort of pastorally laid out his situation, and there would have been so much to go into with Douglas Murray, but Peterson and Pageau sort of launch into these other areas that are not disconnected, but are they talking to Douglas? So Douglas is going to get back in here.
Is that if we lose faith in the transcendent hierarchy, we might lose the entire scientific endeavor.
Let me just briefly, if I may, take us away from the glass of water, because I only have Jonathan Pageau's word that it is a glass of water, and I don't want to get into that. Let me address what I think is a sort of a necessary thing to begin with, which is the issue of the magisteria. We are
now, in a sense, you can look at Murray as being an example of exactly what Pageau is saying, because you have a very combinatorially explosive 10 minutes where Pageau and Peterson have been talking about a bunch of things, and Murray wants to sort of get into it in a concentrated manner and try and make progress.
Talking about them separately, but of course the interrelation of them. Whether or not the realms of science and religion are overlapping magisteria or not. And of course, some people would claim that they're absolutely unrelated. We're getting towards, I think, in this discussion, the realization that, of course, they're overlapping to some degree. We don't know exactly how much. Jonathan probably thinks very significantly. I suspect Jordan thinks to some extent, and I would say to some extent as well. But let me throw out then two issues that I would put as a challenge both for the religious and the non-religious in the discussion that we're heading towards. The first is a challenge for the non-religious, and that's to do with something that Jordan's already talked about, which is the area of ethics and shared values and much more. A great...
Now, I think Murray sees this clearly because, again, he has followed the process of New Atheism, and what they were unable to do, and I think Peterson has touched on this, what they are unable to do is cohere together because they cannot both ritualistically, communally, narratively, they cannot cohere into a hierarchy that finally holds them together.
The challenge for the non-believers in our age is that issue of where the values come from. And as Jordan's already suggested, for instance, the Enlightenment, the idea of rationalism, soul rationalism, which not all Enlightenment thinkers were dealing with, but many were. The idea of rationalism being the sole way in which to discern ethics seems to me not to have been embedded very wide or very deep, and may suggest that it's just not possible as a project. So,
and that would be right. You will not rationally determine the good. You might rationally determine something that is instrumental towards achieving a something that you desire or that you find as good. But this gets back to Wilfrid Sellers and a bunch of stuff that we talked about in previous years.
Quote my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on this: the idea that ethics are self-evident is self-evidently wrong. So let me throw that out first as a challenge for the non-believer. Then the challenge for the believer comes down to this thing that Jordan's also already dealt in, which is the issue of, let's say, myth or story. Because we might agree, for instance, that we need a story to agree upon, or a myth to agree upon, or a set of ideas to...
Now remember that stories are, and myths are compression engines. They take the combinatorial explosiveness of the world and reduce it down into something that over most of our lives, ever since we've been able to achieve an autobiography, which we call ourselves, and have been doing this communally, because ourselves are not just us as individuals, but always known within community. Narratives are the way that we reduce that combinatorial explosiveness and organize ourselves within the arena as agents and actors within the arena in a meaningful way.
To rely upon and to ground ourselves in. And that doesn't necessarily, of course, by any means lead to the fact that those things are also true. We get into the realm of what Schopenhauer in the dialogue on religion, which always made a huge impression on me, deals in, where he says, of course, what he describes as the tragedy of the clergy. That the tragedy of the clergy is that they know the necessity of the thing, they know the truthfulness of the story in a certain...
I'm going to have to read that.
...sense of truthfulness, but could never admit, or their job would be over, that that's what it is. In other words, they have to continue to deal in it as if this is not simply story or unifying myth or anything like that, but is something which has a truth claim behind it. And then let me just say one other thing on that, which is this. The issue of
In other words, it can't just be, as many people want to say, well, and sometimes when I listen to Tom Holland talk about this, I hear him say almost this. I played that clip from my conversation. It doesn't matter whether or not it's true, it's still the greatest story ever told. That, at a deep level, just doesn't wash, because, when I remember being a junior high kid first reading Tolkien, I wanted to live in that world. I think it's our hunger for beauty and meaning and adventure and all that is good. And so I think it's in some ways the deep logic of the ontological argument that we just can't seem to break away from.
Unifying ethic, because it must be what we're sort of somehow also, among other things, as well as trying to define what the true is and what the real is, must be one of the things that we must sort of try to grapple towards. The issue on this seems to me to be, is the Christian ethic, the Christian tradition, to think of it in Hegelian terms, is it an exhausted force or an unexhausted force? This for our age seems to me to be one of the absolutely crucial issues to address.
And again, I think this is why Douglas Murray is so good in these conversations, because I think he is so honest and he is so earnest. And when he say, is it an exhausted force? I mean, for him especially, he senses the teeth of this, because if Christianity is an exhausted force, if it cannot find its way out of the tomb in the West, if in Europe only the stones cry out, and because the people themselves aren't participating in the triumphal entry of the king to his realm, then where are we to go?
Is it exhausted or unexhausted?
Right. I have a few things to say. First, about the idea of the ethic question. Now, there's something which is actually especially in your project, there's something which is more than about ethics and about how we should act. It has to do with the glass, sorry, Douglas, but let's bring it to people now. It has to do with why do we think people are the same? How do we recognize ourselves as being the West or being England or America? Like these things, that's the question. That is, what is it that we have in common, that we celebrate in common, that we recognize in common as binding us together? And my contention is that one of the things that happened during the Enlightenment is that people thought we can get rid of God, but we can keep our nation or whatever. But then that was a slippery slope. And as soon as we got rid of the transcendent, the thing we wanted to have, the king, the queen, the president, this narrative, which was at a lower level, started to crumble and to break down. And so it's not just about how we should act, but it's even how we recognize each other as belonging to the same
category.
Yeah, but let me leap in there with something else.
And I understand what Jonathan is making a point there, but I think there's a disconnect in this conversation between the two rooms. Jordan and Jonathan are I don't know, perhaps they're in Canada and Douglas is in the UK, and they're not connecting. The conversation isn't connecting.
I would go a level beneath that, which is something which I think we could agree on, and which the Enlightenment thinkers were dealing in, and the religious are dealing, which is a much more important issue than mere issues of nationhood or belonging, which is, are we beings with value?
Yeah,
now,
that's for sure very important.
That of course historically is not the case. Most empires in history, in the ancient world and much more, saw most people as having no value.
And I think this is where he's connecting up with the question, is Christianity a spent force?
Revelations, obviously, I use the term in a certain degree of quotation mark, but one of the revelations of the Christian tradition is the idea that everybody does have intrinsic value. And we've all grown up, and everyone during the Enlightenment is dealing in those terms. They're trying to extend, if anything, the idea of Christian value. And there are some Christian theologians who say the very idea of where we are now is, in a sense, an embodiment of the Christian tradition, which is in the tradition of human rights, law, and much more. We accept it like fish accept water, that people have value. But that, of course, as we know, we can look around the world today.
Again, this is Tom Holland's point.
To other places and other parts of the world, and we realize that there are still parts of the world where people do not have any value and their lives are regarded as valueless, and that isn't even regarded as being a tragedy in the way that we would regard it. So the idea that we're beings with value is something that has been so deeply built into our sense as a society that we don't even realize that this is what we're swimming in now. Obviously, that comes from the Christian tradition.
It comes from the idea that we're created in the image of God.
Exactly. The image of God, and then the Enlightenment, the rationalist project, obviously to some extent extends or tries to embed and deepen aspects of that, including.
And I think the point that Douglas Murray makes right there is a really important point, and something for many who say, oh, the Enlightenment was just a big mistake. That's a point for them to contend with, that the Enlightenment, in fact, does try to extend that. And I think that's where Tom Holland really gets it correct in his book Dominion, that part of what happens with Christianity is that this movement, I think it's deeply Barfieldian as well, this movement that you see starting already in the Hebrew prophets, and you see it what Jesus does, and you see it in the Reformation, and you see it in the Enlightenment. It's back and forth on these issues.
Including, of course, I mean, the idea of religious toleration, because again, I mean, one of the reasons why Europe stopped believing was not just what I laid out as having happened in the 19th century, but perhaps the worst realization of all, which was the repeated realization that peoples of faith could not exist together. I mean, this is what Europe learns in the.
And one of the things that we're going to have to look at, and this impacts John Vervaeke's point that, well, the propositional content of a specific religion doesn't necessarily impact the ability of that religion to address the destructiveness of the meaning crisis. I think part of what happens in the movement that Douglas Murray just now points to is that Christianity, in how it impacted the world through the European colonial powers, and we know this, reshaped the definition of religion, and in doing that also reshaped many other world religions, especially as they came into the West and were allowed to propagate in the West. Many people have noted that Buddhism in the West is not Buddhism in the East. And some people have asked, can you actually have Buddhism in the West? Can you actually have Buddhism without the temples and the shrines? Can you actually have Shinto without the ground in which it comes out of? Tom Holland makes the comment about, democracy. We laud it as coming from the Greeks, but the Greek conceptualization of it was radically different than our own. So, in fact, I think one of the things that we have paid too little attention to, especially in this rush for a least common denominator religion in the West by which we can handle pluralism by saying often rather facile things like all religions are the same, is the degree to which we have made many religions the same so that they can be compatible with the Christianity beneath secularism that's in the West.
16th century, and it goes awfully deep, that realization, and changes everything.
Part of the striving towards monotheism, let's say.
Okay, I'm gonna pause here basically because I'm tired, and even though I woke up today without didn't feel any symptoms from COVID at all. I've been doing this for a little while now, and it's kind of late in the day, and I'm a little tired, so I'm gonna stop this here. But I really want to pick this up at 30 minutes in the video. And I have to decide if I'm going to post this on Sunday or Monday, see how much I can do tomorrow. So I had to set up a little studio again in my house, with all whether I've got kids living here or my, wife's convalescing from her COVID or what's happening. I've always got to set things up. So that always takes a little time too. So yeah, this is a very interesting video. I think there are issues with the conversation. I think the conversation could have been improved with a little bit of stewarding to help, instead of having it be an occasion for the different people to sort of bring out their ideas that are sort of latest and most interesting to them, sort of next to each other. It's sort of the difference between you get a bunch of small children together playing. Do they play side by side, sort of swapping things now and then, or do they collectively construct things? And I think there's a lot of interesting playing side by side in this, and a lot of interesting things got pointed out, and a lot of good points got pointed out. But I really wish there was more attention paid to Douglas Murray in terms of how this conversation flowed. They get into some really interesting stuff later, so I very much do want to come back to this. And I know that there are many other conversations in the past that I'd love to bring into this, but we'll see what I can do given I have 2 trips I have to make next week, both for my work with the Christian Reformed Church. That's going to impact my video making. But after this, I swear I'll have more time to make videos. So thank you for your time and attention.